Before dawn, the workers' quarter woke in layers of cold. Pipes rattled in the walls like old bones, shoving a grudging trickle of heated water uphill toward the terraces where true citizens lived. Down here, pressed against the academy's eastern retaining wall, warmth arrived thin and late if it arrived at all. Frost silvered window frames from the inside. Damp sweated through cracked brick. Somewhere close, a baby coughed with a wet, exhausted rhythm, while a woman hushed it with the same 3 words until they blurred into breath. Riven Cole opened his eyes before the bell, sleeping until the bell was for people who could afford it, people with full cupboards, names that still opened doors, levels that solved problems before those problems could grow teeth. He lay still on the narrow cot and counted the morning by the sounds beyond his door. 3 heavy, uneven steps in the hall, old Bryn carrying coal. Scrape, pause, scrape. Widow Sella dragging her wash bucket because the mill had ruined her wrist and no healer worth the title had ever looked at it. 2 boys whispering below the window, trying not to let their teeth chatter while they waited for bakery scraps. Earlier than usual. Word had spread. Trial day. He sat up slowly so the room would not tilt. Hunger had edges this morning. It had sharpened overnight under his ribs until every breath felt measured against what little remained. He pressed a hand to his stomach and let the pain settle. Fighting it wasted strength. Naming it changed nothing. Better to file it with every other small misery that made up a life like his and ask only what might still be useful. The room held almost nothing. Cot, basin, 1 chair with a split seat, and a crooked shelf cut from scavenged wood. On it, folded with more care than its worth deserved, lay the gray shirt and dark trousers he kept for the academy evaluation. He had washed them the night before in water cold enough to numb his fingers, then hung them near the hall heater until they dried stiff and faintly smelling of rust. His boots waited beside the cot, soles patched twice with leather cut from a dead harness. He pulled them on and checked the seam at the left toe by touch. Still holding. The mirror above the basin was so clouded it offered only fragments. A cheekbone, 1 gray-eyed dark hair refusing to lie flat. Nothing about him looked memorable. At the academy that had always been insult and shelter both. He washed with 2 fingers of water and a scrap of soap worn nearly transparent. When he was done, he braced both hands on the basin and looked into the broken glass. 25. Though the hard line around his mouth often made him seem older. Lean in the way poor men became lean, not through discipline but through subtraction. No crest ring, no guild brand, no blessing marks glowing under the skin. When scanned, the truth of him, or at least the truth the world could read, would look exactly as it always had. Low level, worthless class, marginal utility. Expendable. He left before the bell, taking the stairwell instead of the front hall to avoid the landlord's wife. She liked to stand by the entry on collection mornings with her arms folded into her apron, eyes moving from face to face as if estimating resale value. Today she would be searching for anyone dressed too carefully, anyone climbing toward hope. Hope offended people who lived by keeping others trapped. The alley hit him with cold at once. Dawn had not broken, but the sky over the retaining wall had thinned from black to iron gray. Smoke drifted low between leaning rows of brick. The quarter smelled of wet ash, old oil, cabbage water, and bread from somewhere too far away to matter. A line had formed at the public cistern. Men and women stood with pails between their feet, pale status pains hovering over wrists whenever they moved. Riven did not have to try to read them. No one did. The world had been bent around that habit until glancing at another person's worth became as natural as noticing whether they limped. Level 12 mason's hand. Level 9 boiler tender. Level 7 laundress. Level 14 cartwright. Low all of them. Honest levels. Hard-earned and visible. The sort that kept a roof overhead until age, injury, or bad luck hollowed out a life without ever changing what the system displayed. Here, pride had limits. A man could resent being despised by the upper city and still step aside for a level 30 guard, because resentment did not stop a baton. Riven cut behind the ration shed. Two boys crouched in shadow along the bakery route, one gripping a hooked stick ready to snag a dropped loaf from the back of the cart. They saw him and stiffened, expecting warning or competition. He only said, "Driver swings left at the drain on frost mornings. Wheel catches there. If you hook, do it then." The older boy blinked. "Why tell us?" "Because if you hook too early, he'll see you." He walked on before gratitude could become conversation. Observation had fed him more often than courage. Courage made men noticeable. Noticeable men got challenged, used, or broken depending on who had seen them. Observation let him arrive half a step before trouble and leave one step before blame. It let him tell which foreman drank before noon, which patrol captain hated lateness more than theft, which cracked paving stones held enough warmth underneath to save fingers on winter nights. Some called that cowardice because it made them feel braver. Most of them had either moved upward or disappeared. At the quarter gate, two city enforcers stood beneath a lantern whose wick was nearly spent. Their cuirasses gleamed despite the hour. Their capes were lined with real fur. Above one gauntlet glowed a blue pane, level 28 ward guard. The other man's level shone higher still. Neither hid it. Power liked witnesses. "Trial applicants to the left," one said without looking up. A knot of youths and young adults had gathered there already, shoulders rigid, papers clutched in cold hands. Some wore their best clothes. Some wore borrowed ones. One girl had mended a sleeve so neatly the stitching itself looked hopeful. Riven joined them and kept his face blank. The second guard glanced at him, taking in the plain shirt, patched boots, absence of family insignia. "Workers' quarter," Riven nodded. The guard's mouth bent around a smile with no warmth in it. "Academy's generous this year." A few people laughed because laughter near authority was cheaper than silence. Riven let the remark pass through him. There were insults that lived only if fed. They were marched uphill as first light touched the city's upper stone. The change came gradually underfoot. Mud became fitted paving. Cracked walls gave way to dressed granite. Shuttered stalls became polished arcades with brass lamps and carved lintels. Water ran clear in the gutters here. Even the cold smelled cleaner, sharpened by cedar smoke and expensive soap drifting from servant entrances. The academy crowned the ridge beyond the market terraces, all white columns and dark glass, severe enough to suggest wisdom and rich enough to prove it. Training yards spread below the main complex in geometric tiers. Iron target frames stood rimed with frost. Obstacle courses rose in careful symmetry. In the central court, scanning pylons were already active, each crystal core humming with stored mana. Their light shivered pale blue across the flagstones. People were gathering. Families from the middle districts wrapped in thick cloaks, officials carrying slates, candidates in neat clusters by region and sponsor class. Levels flashed and faded over wrists as people checked windows, compared status, boasted softly, lied badly. Riven felt what he always felt in places like this, not fear exactly, but narrowing. Every angle sharpened. Who stared too long? Who ignored him too completely? Which instructors were bored enough to be cruel, and which were cruel enough to use boredom for sport? He recognized Darren Voss before he heard him. Darren stood with 3 sponsored applicants near the second scan line, broad-shouldered and clean-skinned in a fitted training coat edged in family colors. His pain glowed steadily over his wrist. Level 18, Initiate Spear. Strong for his age. Strong enough that people forgave the smaller weaknesses hidden by money and confidence. Darren noticed Riven a heartbeat later and smiled the way boys like him smiled at stray dogs in formal gardens. "Well," he said loudly enough for nearby people to hear, "the quarter sent one after all." A few heads turned. Riven kept walking until a clerk flicked a stylus toward his queue. "Applicants without sponsor marks, third line." Darren drifted closer, boots clicking on stone. "Careful where you stand. The scan might mistake you for maintenance." His friends laughed because it cost them nothing. Riven looked at him then. Darren expected resentment, perhaps shame. Riven gave him neither. He let his gaze move over the expensive spear case, the slight stiffness in Darren's left knee from an old training injury, the faint tremor in the fingers of his right hand from too much stimulant tea. Small things, useful things. His expression did not change. That unsettled Darren more than any retort. He sneered to cover it and turned away. A bronze gong sounded across the yard. Conversation thinned. At the head of the central court, an examiner stepped onto a raised platform in layered midnight blue robes, silver insignia catching pale sun. Her level flared when she activated the master array. Level 41 Senior Evaluator. Her voice carried with polished ease. By civic decree and academy charter, all applicants for preliminary consideration will submit to public status verification. False windows, glamour overlays, and sponsor interference will be treated as fraud. The pylons brightened. One by one candidates stepped forward. Names were called. Crystals sang. Status panes unfolded above each applicant, large enough for the crowd to read. Some drew approving murmurs. A level 16 Stoneguard subclass, a rare wind affinity, a healer line with uncommon reserve. Every success straightened one spine while bending another. When his name came, it sounded smaller than the rest. Riven Cole, unsponsored, District East retaining quarter. He stepped into the scan ring. Frost crackled under his boots. For one breath the whole court focused around him, crystals aligning to read bone, blood, monochannels, class imprint, visible truth. The pane that opened overhead was pale, plain, and brutally short. Riven Cole. Level 3. Class. Porter. Affinity. Negligible. Silence held for half a heartbeat, then the yard broke into that low, ugly sound people made when relieved the humiliation belonged to someone else. Darren laughed first. Level 3. Even a clerk looked up. The evaluator checked her slate, then him, then the slate again as if hoping some administrative error might save time. Porter class, she said. No combat designation, no technical discipline. Negligible affinity confirmed. People were already losing interest. Riven knew the sequence. First amusement, then dismissal, then the social blindness reserved for those beneath useful notice. The evaluator made a small motion. You may remain for baseline physical assessment if you insist, but your file is non-competitive. Not rejected, because the academy liked the appearance of fairness. Not welcomed, because fairness was all he was worth. Riven inclined his head and stepped out of the ring. As he crossed the array's edge, something brushed the inside of his awareness. It was not sound or sight. It felt like discovering a door in a dark room because the air around its frame was colder than the wall. For one impossible instant, beneath the fading public pane over his wrist, another layer gathered and hesitated just beyond what the crystals could catch, as if the system itself had glanced at him and chosen not to speak aloud. Then it vanished. His public pane dissolved, leaving only the stamped summary every candidate would carry for the rest of the day. Level 3. Porter. No notable affinity. Yet under that emptiness, somewhere deeper than skin, something remained. It did not glow. It did not speak. It simply existed with patient certainty, like a second pulse waiting to be noticed. Next group to the practical floor, a proctor called. Movement broke the moment. Candidates were herded toward the inner gates in clusters made by confidence. Higher-level applicants drifted together without discussion, armored in better cloth and better assumptions. The rest moved where space remained. Riven took his place among them and kept his face unreadable. The practical floor occupied a sunken basin, enclosed by high walls etched with old ward lines. From above it might have looked ceremonial. Standing at the edge, Riven saw what it truly was, a controlled failure pit. Narrow bridges crossed trenches full of murky water. Rusted bells hung from iron frames. Waist-high pillars broke sight lines. At the far end, 3 bronze markers waited beside a raised platform. The path between them and the candidates was a maze of slick stone, pressure plates, swinging arms, and shuttered wall slots large enough to release anything from blunted bolts to caged vermin. Nothing there was meant to kill outright. That was the Academy's mercy. maiming had never troubled policy. A senior instructor in a dark coat stepped onto an overlooking gallery, reach the far platform and strike a marker, any marker. Fastest times improve placement. Falling, freezing, and begging for extraction do not. A careful ripple of laughter passed through the spectators. Interference between candidates is permitted. Deliberate lethal assault is not. If you cannot continue, raise a hand and remain still. If you panic and run blindly, the floor will educate you. Riven studied the basin while others postured. The bridges were too obvious. One showed darker stone at its center where repeated impacts had left spiderweb cracks. The bells were not targets. Their clappers had been removed. Noise triggers then. The water trenches were shallow enough to tempt desperate crossings, which meant the danger was not depth but what entered the water after someone fell. The pillars looked useful as cover until he noticed hairline seams around several of them, rotating sections or spring-loaded faces. A pressure gathered behind his eyes, soft and alien. Hidden veil system initialized. The words did not appear before him. They unfolded inside his awareness, crisp and silent. Primary condition met. Remain unseen by evaluative systems. Secondary condition available. Survive practical assessment without raising visible output beyond assigned rank. Reach final platform after aiding one competitor who cannot repay you. Reward preview withheld. Riven's throat tightened. He bent as if adjusting the wrap on his wrist and breathed through his nose. No one else reacted. No examiner looked alarmed. Whatever lived in him belonged to him alone. A horn sounded. The first wave surged. A spear-class woman launched onto the center bridge as if the trial had been built for her. 2 others followed. Riven did not move. Halfway across, the bridge dropped one side by a handspan. The lead woman compensated at once, but the second candidate lost balance. A wall slot snapped open and fired 3 blunt bolts into his ribs, pitching him into the rail. The third slammed into him from behind. Both went over into the trench. The water erupted with wire-thin movement. Not snakes, leech ropes, training bred and blood-blind. The woman in front never looked back. Riven counted 3 breaths and took the left route. He did not run. Running committed you before information was complete. He crossed the first strip of stone just as a broad brawler barreled past on the right and stamped a square half a shade cleaner than the rest. The slab sank. A swinging arm burst from a pillar and caught the man under the jaw with a crack that silenced the basin for one clean instant before he pinwheeled into dust. Riven marked the trigger and kept moving. At the first bell frame, 2 candidates ducked under together. One brushed the metal. It gave no sound, but the floor ahead flashed amber and a curtain of chalky mist blasted upward from hidden vents. Both stumbled back coughing, eyes streaming, blinded long enough for one to collide with a pillar just as its stone face rotated and clipped his knee sideways. So that was the lesson. Not speed alone. Composure under humiliation. Riven slipped around the frame without touching it and took the narrow line between 2 pillars. His boots found old scuffs rather than fresh gouges. Others had discovered this route before, but not many. Good. Paths used sometimes were safer than paths used always. The academy varied obvious traps and punished pattern followers. Ahead, a slim trainee in gray froze on a pressure seam, staring at the shifting floor beyond. 17 perhaps. Level 4 if Riven remembered the earlier registration correctly. Scrivener subclass. Not built for this either. Move or drop, someone shouted behind him. The boy flinched, shifted the wrong foot, and the seam lit red. Riven lunged before he could argue with himself. He caught the back of the trainee's collar and yanked hard enough to wrench his own shoulder. A blade-thin partition slammed down where the boy had been, shaving sparks from stone. The force of the pull sent them both sprawling behind a pillar. Pain tore along Riven's arm, hot and deep. He bit the inside of his cheek and swallowed the sound that wanted out. The trainee stared at him. "Why? Left side only," Riven muttered, already rising. "Follow worn edges, don't step where the stone looks newer." That was enough. Not rescue, merely a chance. The boy nodded too fast. Inside Riven, the silent text returned. Hidden condition advanced. Mercy rendered where gain was unlikely. Veil stability increased. No visible sign accompanied the words, yet the climbing panic in his spine thinned into something colder and cleaner. Whether the system rewarded him or merely sharpened what was already there, he could not tell. His breathing steadied and he moved on. For 10 heartbeats the route held. Then a hammer-class candidate vaulted a pillar to cut ahead, landed badly, and drove his heel into a lateral plate. 3 stone arms snapped from the wall in sequence. One caught the hammer-class in the hip and spun him directly into Riven. Riven twisted, took the impact on his injured shoulder and nearly blacked out. White burst across his vision. His boots lost purchase. He slid toward the trench lip, fingers scraping wet stone. Below, dark water writhed. He hit the edge chest first, half his body tipping over. The stink from the trench rose rank with iron and algae. A leech rope launched upward and slapped around his forearm with shocking strength. He grabbed it before instinct could jerk him away. Pulling fed them. He had seen dockworkers lose flesh that way. Pinning the slick body against stone, he drove his knee down until it split. Black fluid sprayed his sleeve. Another shape lunged from below. The gray-coated trainee seized the back of Riven's belt and hauled with a desperate grunt. It was barely enough. Riven rolled free as the second leech snapped at air. For a moment he lay shaking, every muscle cramped, shoulder feeling half torn loose. Dust stuck to the wet smear on his sleeve. Above, the gallery remained impassive. No one called halt. No one marked that he had nearly gone in. If you survived, the academy called it learning. If you failed, they called it sorting. Go, Riven rasped. The trainee fled. Riven pushed himself up more slowly and nearly missed the stillness above the opposite wall. Not on the public gallery. Higher, inside a narrow maintenance arch between ward stones. A figure stood there in muted gray, half hidden by lattice shadow. No academy trim. No badge bright enough to catch light. Yet the stance was wrong for a laborer and too relaxed for a guard. The figure's head had turned toward the basin not when the strongest candidates surged ahead, but when Riven tore the leech in half. The distance hid the face. It did not hide attention. Riven dropped his gaze at once and limped onward, forcing the uneven stride to look worse than it was. Let them see a weak porter surviving by luck, stubbornness, and scraps of borrowed nerve. Nothing more. The final stretch narrowed into 3 lanes divided by waist-high stone. The center path looked almost clear except for scattered plates. Too clear. On the left, a candidate with a fire affinity triggered a burst of steam that sent him reeling back with blistered hands. On the right, 2 spear users tangled in a shoving match, while the timer glyph over their marker drained from gold to red. Riven took the center and watched the shadows, not the floor. The sun sat low enough that each moving mechanism betrayed itself a blink before release. There, a faint interruption, narrow as a reed. He slowed by half a step. A weighted blade swept across the lane where his knee would have been. He stepped over its return arc and planted on the edge of the third plate instead of the center. It depressed without locking, safe enough for someone his size, not for the heavier candidates pounding behind him. A crash sounded as one of them proved the point. The bronze markers waited ahead, one already claimed by a lancer grinning with raw relief. The second lane jammed as 2 candidates arrived together and tangled arms. Riven's lane remained open for 1 more second. Then the air behind him changed. Not sound. Intent. Someone was coming fast, timing the rush to use his body as a trap finder over the final meters, and the hidden watcher above had not looked away. Riven did not turn. The urge to look back was the same urge that got people crippled in the lanes. He let his left shoulder dip as if panic had stolen his balance, gave the runner behind him a weak man's mistake to trust, and reached for the bronze marker with less than full extension. The hand aiming to shove him landed on empty air. Momentum did the rest. The charging candidate slammed past his hip, boot coming down squarely on the center of the third plate. The lock beneath answered with a metallic snap. The weighted blade Riven had just avoided returned on its hidden track with enough force to shear through leather and bone. The man screamed and folded. Not dead. Not yet. But finished. Riven touched the bronze marker in the same breath and felt completion pulse up the post into his palm. The lane glyph flashed white. Somewhere above, a bell rang once. Qualified. He stepped aside before the spreading blood could touch his boots. Medics sprinted toward the trapped candidate while officials barked for order. Riven glanced once toward the wall. One figure occupied the maintenance arch. By the time candidates were herded into the sorting court, the sun had sunk behind the western towers. A clerk with an inked monocle stamped a slate against each qualifier's wrist sigil and sent them into separate queues by visible level and class, smiling more easily at the impressive ones. Riven's turn lasted 3 seconds. Level 3, the clerk said, already bored. Unassigned support tendency, temporary dormitory writ, report at dawn for aptitude partitioning. The slate flashed and spat a thin copper token into his hand. Temporary. Low priority, barely tolerated. He tucked it away and headed for the outer gate, but a voice stopped him. You, center lane. The speaker wore dark green over hard leather with no academy insignia at all. That was worse. Academy officials followed rules when watched. Private retainers followed owners. A blackthorn crest fastened his cloak. Riven turned with careful deference. Sir. The man studied him as if wondering why a pebble in his boot deserved notice. Lady Vale's observer in the maintenance arch watched your lane. You were observed. Riven let confusion touch his face. Observed finishing, sir. Observed surviving. The retainer stepped closer. A level 3 support with no declared combat class should not read timing windows that cleanly. Riven made himself hesitate. I worked freight lifts on the South Keys. Old pulleys, worn teeth, swinging loads. If you don't learn timing, you lose fingers. A lie made from true pieces stood best. The man's eyes narrowed, not convinced, not unconvinced. If House Vale sends for you, you answer. Before Riven could reply, another voice cut in sharp with irritation. House retainers do not preempt academy intake. A woman in Academy Blue approached with 2 scribes, visible level only 7, and carrying the kind of authority that decided where people slept and whether they ate. Her gaze moved over Riven, paused at his wrist token, and cooled further. This candidate is not assigned to any house. Not yet, the retainer said. Not at all if he washes out tomorrow. She turned to Riven. You performed above statistical expectation. Some candidates attempt fraud through forbidden aids. Show me your hands. He raised them, calloused palms, dirt under the nails, nothing glowing, branded, or marked. At a sign from her, one scribe passed a brass lens over his forearms, throat, and temples. The metal warmed but did not light. No active charm residue, no borrowed blessing, no smuggled alchemy. The registrar's suspicion remained because suspicion cost her nothing. You will submit for deeper screening if summoned. Yes, ma'am. Do not leave the lower dormitory district. That told him where the academy meant weak candidates to stay. Outside the inner walls, near enough to sweep away if necessary. The retainer gave him one last measuring look. Remember House Vale. Riven bowed just enough to insult no one and walked off before either could invent another reason to keep him. Night in the lower dormitory district smelled of lamp oil, boiled grain, and wet stone. The quarter reserved for temporary candidates crouched in the Academy City's shadow like something tolerated rather than made. Beds were rented by the plank. Drains clicked with things that had too many legs. Riven did not spend his first copper on food. He bought a cracked basin, a candle stub, and half an hour in a lockable wash closet behind a boarding hall kitchen. Only after the bolt slid home did he breathe properly. The room was barely large enough to sit in. Lime scale crusted the basin. Water dripped behind the wall. He set the candle in a rusted bracket, rolled up his sleeve, and whispered, "Status." The hidden veil system answered where no ordinary system should have. No light spilled into the room. No visible sigils flared over his skin. The interface existed only in the pressure behind his eyes, in lines cut into thought with impossible certainty. Hidden veil system. Visible profile, level 3. Concealed progress, level 6. Veil integrity, stable. Completed conditions, survive evaluation through misdirection. Exploit hostile intent without exposure. Advance while underestimated. New trait resonance detected. Thread sense I. He stared until the words settled. Level 6. Not public, not readable by ordinary inspection, but real enough that his pulse changed. He focused on the new trait and the room rearranged itself around his awareness. The drip behind the wall separated into intervals. The looseness in the door bolt announced itself as a tiny shiver of metal against wood. Rats in the drain became positions rather than sounds. It was pattern made tactile inside the mind. Thread sense. He drew a chipped eating knife from his boot, balanced it on 2 fingers, and let it fall. The knife's wobbling descent seemed to drag a faint line through the dark. He caught the handle cleanly an inch above the floor. He tried again. By the 12th drop he was smiling despite himself. His body had changed too, in smaller, harder ways. Cleaner placement in the feet, better breath control, more reserve in his legs after the trial than he had any right to possess. Which meant that if anyone discovered it, they would not call him gifted. They would call him wrong. A scrape outside the wash closet cut through the thought. Then another. 3 sets of feet trying to sound like one. Street predators, not guards. Riven pinched out the candle and let darkness take the room. Threads bloomed in it, weight leaning against the door. One body by the hinge, one just off-center. One waiting back with confidence, likely the knife hand. "Easy coin, little scholar," a voice said through the wood. "Open before we kick." Riven looked at the basin, the chain holding it from a wall hook, and the angle of the inward swinging door, and felt the answer before he formed it. He lifted the basin and set it atop the lintel as quietly as he could. Then he slid the bolt halfway open and flattened himself against the wall. The kick burst the door inward. The basin fell. Water and cracked pottery exploded across the first man's face. He cursed and staggered. The second lunged through blind, hit the slick threshold, and crashed shoulder first into the hinge side. Riven drove the edge of his hand into the man's neck, enough to steel the legs. Then he took the falling knife from the third attacker before the third understood he had thrown it too close. No flourish, no speech. One reverse grip pressed under a jaw in darkness did more than any threat. "Leave," Riven said softly. The leader froze. He had expected prey, not silence with a blade inside it. "Keep it," he hissed to the others. "Move." They dragged the choking one away. Their boots faded down the alley. Riven waited to a count of 100 before relighting the candle. Under the fading system text, a new line had appeared. "Hidden path available. Follow the drowned thread beneath the city." No map, no explanation, only that. He should have slept. Instead, less than an hour later, he stood at the oldest drain stair below the temporary dormitories, hood up, knife hidden, copper token tied under his shirt. The lower city was forbidden after curfew. Moss glazed the steps. Ancient runoff channels merged into tunnels older than the academy itself. He went down by smell and by thread sense. Following every place the air turned colder, and the stone seemed to remember deeper water. Twice he avoided lantern patrols before they reached the corner. Once he froze flat to a wall as something huge shifted in a culvert below, scales or plated hide scraping old brick. The drowned thread led on. The academy city above had been built in layers, but down here the older city showed through. Arches from one age had been bricked over by another. Pipes newer than memory fed channels older than law. Through it all, beneath the stink of runoff and mold, ran a current of stillness unlike ordinary ruin. Not dead, waiting. At last he found a sealed service arch half collapsed by age. Every official mark once carved over it had been chiseled away. In the center remained only a circular depression crusted with mineral salt, as if some sigil had been ripped out by force. As he stepped near, the hidden veil system stirred so sharply it made his teeth ache. Secret chamber resonance confirmed. Unregistered inheritance nearby. Risk, severe. Reward, deniable. Riven crouched and touched the circular depression. The stone was warm, not with the memory of day, warm from the other side. A pulse answered his hand, slow and enormous, like the heartbeat of something buried under the Academy city since before the Academy had learned its own name. Dust sifted from the arch. Somewhere far off, metal answered metal with a note too low to be sound. The warmth spread into his palm, up his wrist, into the hidden place where the system lived. For one instant he thought the veil might tear, that the false, lowly shape he presented to the world would split and pour every secret into the open. Instead, the pressure steadied. Thread sense sharpened until he could feel lines in the stone, old pathways, locks without keys, wards gone dormant and one that had not. Beneath his hand lay not a dead seal but a sleeping interface, denied, wounded, still listening. Riven swallowed and kept his fingers where they were. Behind him the tunnel remained empty. Ahead, beyond the blocked arch, something vast paid attention. Then a voice opened its eyes inside the same hidden chamber of his mind where the system spoke. It did not come through his ears. It was older than speech and still unmistakably language, dry with age, edged with surprise, and carrying the weight of a mind that had survived by outweighing history itself. "You are not supposed to be able to hear me, are you?"